So in previous videos, we talked about life, the origins of life, where life came from, and what the evidence leads us to conclude that life brings forth life, and that we've never observed non-life bringing into existence life, therefore rendering the idea of abiogenesis unscientific. Then we moved on to talk about complexity and how the evidence tells us that we observe that complexity comes into existence through an intelligent mind. We see human beings doing that. We see birds creating nests. We see that kind of thing happening. That's observable, and we can demonstrate and test that. So that's a reasonable option. But we don't see non-intelligence bringing into existence intelligence. We see DNA, incredibly complex coding systems bringing into existence complexity, and there's a lot of information there. Information brings forth information. So we don't see non-intelligence bringing into existence intelligence. And then we moved on to talk about time, and how time itself is a physical property, and that whatever brought that into existence must itself be external to it, timeless. And so we have an eternal attribute belonging to this creative entity. And then we moved on to talk about the power of this entity, that it must be huge because the creation itself demonstrates the incredible vastness and the power that the designer must have. And so from there we worked out that these four attributes, eternally powerful, incomprehensibly intelligent, creator, life-giving creator, must be is the most reasonable explanation based on the evidence, and that is the definition of God. And so today we're talking about some of God's attributes. Now one of the concepts I want to bring to your attention is the fact that whoever designs a system has the right to define the rules for that system. And I'm a software developer myself. If I were to create a computer program, like a computer game, I, the designer, would get to program the rules for that program. So I, the developer, input the rules into the program, and whatever exists within the system, within the program, abides by the rules that I dictate. And so that's one of the attributes that alone belong to the designer of the system. Similarly, God, this God who is eternally powerful, incomprehensibly intelligent, and life-giving, also has the right to define the rules for the system that he created. The created don't dictate to the creator what the rules are. It's the other way around. And if you've ever played a computer game, you'll realize that's the case. And you can argue, hey, these rules should be this. And you're free to argue, but at the end of the day, it's the designer that gets to set the rules. So that's what God did. God created everything. He created the rules also. And so those rules, we're not talking about what the rules are, because we haven't yet established who he is. But those rules, whatever they may be, are the standard for what in religion is often termed as righteousness or holiness. Those rules become the definition for righteousness and holiness, whatever that designer dictates. Alright, so that's point number one. Whoever this eternally powerful, incomprehensibly intelligent, life-giving designer is, he is also holy and righteous by definition. And so whatever does not conform to that holy and righteous standard is by definition sinful or rebellious. And so that's where we get those terms from. Alright, so now we're going to step aside and we're going to jump into the atheistic worldview for a moment. Now this worldview relies on the presupposition of abiogenesis, which we demonstrated earlier to be unobservable and unlikely. And we don't even know whether it would be possible because we've never observed such a thing, but it heavily relies on this idea that there must have been some point where non-life brought into existence life which defies observation, and therefore I would say is absolutely unscientific. It also relies on the presupposition that complexity was brought into existence by non-intelligence, which goes against everything that we observe in nature. And it also and so we'll stop there. So basically it relies on those presuppositions. That complexity was brought into existence through non-intelligence, that life came about through non-life. And so if you assume those, and I would argue that would be very unwise to do because it defies and flies in the face of all observation. But if you do accept that, and then you build your worldview upon those presuppositions, then you're in a problem when it comes to morality. because ultimately objective morality doesn't exist. And so here you have what we call subjective morality, which means that morality doesn't really exist except in the minds of human beings. So we call that relative morality, which means that it's subjective, which means that there is no way for us to impose moral absolutes upon other people. Now, there is no doubt about it. Atheists, people who hold to the worldview that God does not exist, they do impose moral absolutes upon others. But when they do so inconsistently, and they're borrowing from a theistic worldview to do so. So they're inconsistent. It is absolutely impossible to live out relative morality. It's impossible to live out the atheistic worldview consistently because they have to borrow from the biblical worldview. Otherwise, they can't live their lives in the way that they do. Now, whenever a person says, you should not, or you should have, it's appealing to a standard that transcends both the two minds of the people engaged in any given situation. So, I believe that it is absolutely wrong for a man to rape an innocent child. Now, why is that the case? I as a believer, as a Christian, am appealing to an absolute moral which transcends me, and that moral comes from the Creator himself, and that is an eternal moral, something that has had no beginning, no end. It's a characteristic of God himself. So that's always existed, I believe, based on my worldview. But the atheist, who does not believe in God, has a subjective moral standard which says that, in my opinion, it is wrong for a man to rape an innocent little child. In his opinion, that's wrong. But ultimately, the man in that situation, so where you would say you should not have raped that child, that person, if morality is relative, if it is subjective, that person has an equal right to say, well, I believe based on my subjective moral standard that it was right. And there is no moral absolute standard to which both people can appeal to. It's just subjective. In the same way that I prefer the taste of yogurt to mushrooms, it's taste in an atheistic worldview. But in a theistic worldview where God does exist, where there is an eternally powerful, incomprehensibly intelligent, life-giving God, then morality is absolute, and we can appeal to an absolute moral standard and say, you should not. And you can live that out consistently, but an atheistic worldview, you cannot live that out consistently. And so I just wanted to point out that to you, and to think about it, really think about it. But when a person says that God is holy and righteous, it's because he was the designer of the system, and all of his characteristics and attributes define and make up the definition of what true holiness and righteousness is. And from this, different religions come up with rule systems. And now some of these include, and we as human beings have what we call a conscience, which means means with, science means knowledge. With knowledge, we are all with knowledge of God's law written on our hearts. And some of these are, for example, do not lie. So why is lying an absolutely immoral thing to do? Why is it immoral? It's because God is truthful, at least the biblical God, to which is what I'm going to argue, and we're going to talk about that later on. But God demonstrates himself and reveals himself as being one who is the truth. He is the truth. He is truthful, and there are no lies found in his character. And so that's why lying is wrong, because it directly rebels against the character and standard of God. And later on, we'll discover that God made man in his image and likeness, and so we were made to reflect the image and likeness of God, but things were distorted, and we're going to talk about that later. And so that's the concept there. Everything that is directly rebellious towards God's character is by definition sinful, and so there the problems arise. But the big concept I want you to understand is that in an atheistic worldview, in a worldview where morality is subjective It is impossible to live out that worldview. You will always see atheists saying you should not. This is wrong. Atheists debate and say, why? Sometimes they get angry and accuse people of lying. Well, in atheistic worldview, why is lying wrong? It's completely subjective. If you would follow the logic out to if you extrapolate that out, that's the only conclusion you can make. You cannot appeal to moral absolutes. That's a biblical presupposition, not an atheistic presupposition, and they are incompatible. They're mutually incompatible. You cannot reconcile an atheistic worldview with an objective, moral, absolute standard. The two work against each other, and they just don't work. So every time an atheist imposes any kind of moral standard, if you're an atheist, every time you do that, you remember you are borrowing from a theistic worldview, and you need to remember that. So that's today. That's the piece of evidence today. That one of the attributes for this God that we have provided evidence for in the previous 4 videos. He is also holy and righteous. So keep that in mind as we progress to the next piece of evidence. Thanks.